fellow travelers. Welcome to the 100th level of the RPG Cave. I am one of your hosts, the level 99 human archmage, Ryan Turford. I am joined, as always, by the level 99 elf medic, Mr. Garret Bland. Garret, how are you doing on this lovely, lovely Monday evening? We made it. We made it to level 100. We're finally here. We did it.
We made it. For folks who are listening, I just did the dab. I unlocked a new emote at the 100th level, and it is the dab. So there you go. That's what's happening on the 100th level, Ryan.
But you did.
We just unlock emotes.
I mean, we got to the 100th level, but you didn't go up a level. You just got an extra skill, the dab. Like, was that with microtransactions?
No.
Garret?
I had to pay for it. Yeah. It was a microtransaction box type of thing.
Okay.
And it was a 0.001% chance of getting this emote as a NFT. So it was a fungible token, but I did get it. And so I'm going to sell it for 1 million digital Bitcoin.
Why did you have to bring NFTs into this, man? We were having such great banter. The show was going so well, and you bring NFTs into the show, Garret. What are you doing?
Of course.
I
had to do it, man.
Good God. Well, this is the RPG Cave where we talk about RPGs all the time and not NFTs. So folks at home, if you want to support the show, there's a number of awesome ways to do that. Number one, if you're watching the live stream right now, over at youtube.com/carpoolgaming, or if you're watching the video on demand later, don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you haven't hit that subscribe button already, and let us know in the comments below what you think about tabletop role-playing games. Have you played D&D before? Have you played any of the other myriad other tabletop role-playing games before? Let us know in the comments below. And also, of course, hit that notification bell, or, Nicolas Cage roundhouse kick that notification bell to be notified whenever we go live or when we put up new videos on the channel. Also, if you're listening on audio feeds, don't forget to rate us there, as well as, make sure to subscribe there as well. Man, I'm just a mess tonight, Garret. I just don't even know what's going on anymore.
We're all messes tonight.
I know. And then last but not least, if you want early access to all of our audio, or one big audio feed with all the Carpool Gaming content or some exclusive content, you can head on over to our Patreon, patreon.com/Carpool Gaming. Throw a little tip in the old tip jar, just like Jonas Young did, who we're welcoming back as a gold member. Thank you so much, Jonas, for hopping back in. And of course, Garret, we have to promote this because we have to promote the Patreon, because that's what we do here.
Of course.
We got to give a shout out to the Pants Patreon podcast for Patrons podcast that came out yesterday with yours, the doctor. Well, I can't even.
Yes,
I can point correctly.
Right here.
I swear.
Right here. Yes,
Garret, you put for your episode. People really liked it too. Like, we're getting a lot of good comments.
Well, that's good. I'm glad people like my rambling. You know what? I had a lot of help from the amazing patrons sending in some awesome questions, and I'm very glad to do it. It was very fun to talk through all the non-gaming stuff too. If you're really curious about like academia and stuff, check it out. Check out that episode.
Yeah, generally, like the Pants Patreon podcast is kind of where we get to talk about, non-gaming stuff, or talk about, topics we usually don't get to talk about on a lot of the shows. So if you want to learn more just about Garret, you can definitely go check that out on the Patreon. That's available to, of course, all the people at the exclusive tier and above. And then my episode's actually coming up in 2 weeks again. It'll be my turn again, because Court's this week, and then my episode's next week. So there you go. You can learn more about us there. But Garret, before we actually read from the sacred text, we got a little side quest we got to go journey on.
We did,
because you brought this to my attention that we needed to have a discussion about this. So we're going to have a discussion about this again. So we're going to resume our discussion about, is Final Fantasy 16 an RPG? This is round 2, because
round 2.
Garret and I talked about this before. I'm in the camp where I feel like Final Fantasy 16 is an RPG, but it's like borderline RPG and just straight action game. But Garret, your opinion has changed. Tell me about it.
Well, okay. If we're going by the definition that we set, I am not going to objectively say this is not an RPG. Okay. Let's just lay the groundwork. Final Fantasy 16 is an RPG, just like Zelda 2 is like an RPG. Okay. Anyways, I'm going through this, man. And I hope we do a review discussion soon. I don't know if you want to set that up, later on in a few weeks or something like that.
So just in the spirit of transparency, yes, there is a review discussion coming.
Okay.
I'm kind of waiting for everyone else on the team to kind of finish the game, because Matt's
I know
playing
Matt finished.
Matt finished. Court's still playing it, I think. and then you're still playing it, and then I'm finished. So I kind of want to wait for either of you to finish or both of you to finish, and then we'll kind of
I'm getting there. I'm like hold on, I'm trying to I built a workshop.
Okay.
How about that?
I know
yes,
where
I'm
you're
around there.
Yeah, you're like
Yeah.
you're like halfway through the game.
I'm more than come on, I'm like more than halfway. Anyways, I just think of the group of games that Final Fantasy 16 is kind of in the camp now for me.
Mhm.
And it is very light RPGs. You can argue this. You can argue it's an action RPG or it is an action adventure game with RPG elements. Now, because of the pedigree of what Final Fantasy is, everyone's going to say it's a action RPG. And I think that's what's going to be the definition going forward. I just look at games like the Sony third person action game like Ghost of Tsushima, Horizon, and God of War, the three pillars really of Sony games. And arguably it's in that camp of just like you got a character with a set of skills that's going through a story. It's not really open world like Horizon or Ghost, but it's definitely like a story-driven linear game with some side quests, very similar to God of War. And I know some people out there, I haven't played too much God of War, but I hear there's like a little bit more in-depth RPG mechanics in the second one, so on and so forth. So I just think, calling it a very RPG to me, it's hard. And even comparing it to like the seminal action RPG games I kind of associate with, I'm mainly drawn to like, let's say the game like Witcher, Witcher 3, and it's a very different action RPG. And I call that more of a role-playing game just because it has, I want to sound just like a little specific just for me. This is like kind of like for me and not for everyone else. It's a lot bit more involved with just like what's a monster weak or strong against. How do you handle a monster hunt? How do you go through like a quest? You kind of have to think about, or not really think about it, but you have to investigate how to like overcome. Whereas I feel like this game is like, okay, let's go to the next level. All right, smash that square, triangle, and the special skills button. All right, go to the next level, which isn't a bad thing. It's a very good game of that. But that's just me. It's just that it's an action game with very light RPG mechanics. You can diversify a little bit. There are stats, there are levels. It's just, man, oh man, it's telling me this is a role-playing game. It's like, well, I guess God of War is an RPG then. And that's just
and people have made that argument before. I mean, it's not even that argument isn't out there. I actually think that Final Fantasy 16, when I compare it to God of War Ragnarok, because I've played both of them pretty recently, I will say that I personally think that 16 is definitely more of an RPG than Ragnarok is.
Okay.
But at the same time, as I talked about last week, like 16 and Ragnarok aren't really too different from each other. And it is like, again, it's kind of on like the borderline of what I would consider an RPG. So it's not like, I'm not arguing with some of these people out there, Garret, who are saying like it's a full-on RPG like other RPGs. I'm saying it's like as close to an action game as you could possibly get before not calling it an RPG anymore. It's what is kind of my standpoint. So I don't think you and I are actually really too far off from the way we feel about it. Like I feel like you're just a touch in the other direction than I am when it comes to
when I just got to the hunts and did like 4 or 5 hunts, and I'm like, okay, guys, this is not it's not supposed to be that involved with side RPG mechanic stuff, and that's totally fine. And I also want to preface that, it's just kind of my own bias with just action games in general. I'm not a big action person. And, I go back to like, classic role-playing games. Let's just take a game like Chrono Trigger. It's not like, oh, it has side quests, it's more in depth. I just think of that as a classic RPG because, you have party members, you have some turn-based mechanics that, there's different reasonings for different strokes of different RPGs. So yeah. This is definitely, we're on the same boat here.
Yeah, like actually, and when you bring up the side stuff, like it really actually feels more like an MMO with its side content than a traditional game. Like you can definitely tell like this is made by Creative Business Unit 3, aka the Square Enix studio that makes Final Fantasy 14, because
That's
the
true.
side content in this, it very much feels like the side content in Final Fantasy 14 does.
Go pick up flowers.
Yeah,
Deliver dirt.
between what you're actually doing in them, but also the way that it enhances the story or the way it tells the stories in those things. Where some of the stories in the side quests are inconsequential, but I can assure you later in the game there are side quests of big story significance that you will actually see later on in the game, or ones that tell like their own interesting stories on their own, which I think I mentioned before, Garrett. I like that they feel kind of Witcher-like in their in the way that they tell some of their side stories later on.
Okay, sure.
So I do think like there are side missions towards the end of the game, or even in like when you get to this specific area. I won't talk about it here for spoilers.
Is it later? Okay, it's like
after. It's actually probably around the part you're at now, if I'm being honest, Garrett.
Okay.
There are specific side.
I mean, a workshop sounds promising. Just letting you know.
Yeah. Yes.
Like, exactly. Okay. There's something there. Yeah. Over halfway through the game, there's something there. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Exactly.
I'm not begrudging, guys. I'm loving Final Fantasy, and that's why I'm still playing it. It's not like I'm disliking it. It's just calling it an RPG is hard for me.
To the point where you even ran a poll on your Twitter this week about Final Fantasy, which we'll actually get to a little bit later. So don't talk about it now, Garrett. We'll get to it
for sure.
A little bit. But now, Garrett, it is time to read from the sacred texts, because we're gonna grab our D20s. We're gonna get our 20-sided die, our 6-sided die,
like the nerds
4-sided die. We're gonna put up we're gonna get our bag of Cheetos and our sodas, and we're gonna put up that little wall and get our like dungeon books out, because it's time to talk about tabletop role-playing games tonight.
Yeah,
that is the topic for tonight's episode, because over the years, first of all, tabletop role-playing games go all the way back to like the 60s and 70s. They are very, very old, and of course there are bajillion video games kind of basically based off different licensed tabletop role-playing games. So what we're going to do is we're going to do like an overhead discussion about tabletop role-playing games. We're not going to dive too deep into any of the games or the series that we're going to talk about tonight. We'll just talk about them on the surface, and of course any games that we've talked about played before, we'll kind of go talk about it a little bit. Also, for folks that are wondering, because Baldur's Gate 3, that's part of the reason why we're doing this episode tonight. It's because Baldur's Gate 3 is actually going to be out in a couple weeks. And we're kind of doing this to celebrate it. We also might be doing a separate Baldur's Gate episode in the future. Also, again, probably to celebrate Baldur's Gate. Maybe we do that around when the PlayStation version of Baldur's Gate comes out in September, but we'll see.
Isn't that a weird news? Like Baldur's Gate 3, they're like, okay, it's coming out on PlayStation, and we technically can't put it on Xbox yet. It is very hard to put it on Xbox.
Yeah.
And then PC is earlier now. And it's like, well, this is a mess coming in, but I'm sure it's going to be great.
Yeah, the PC version's been in early access since 2020.
Oh yeah, forever.
So like it's one of those things where we like it of course makes sense that it would actually come out first. I'm actually surprised that the PC version didn't come out like earlier this year, and then the PlayStation version came out later. Kind of like something like they did, like Hoyoverse did with Honkai Star Rail. So I'm actually kind of surprised they didn't go down that route. But and in fact, Garrett, you remember when Baldur's Gate 3 was a Stadia exclusive at one point?
Oh,
man, those were the days.
You remember Stadia?
Yes.
That wow.
That was a platform that existed. Yeah.
Yep. It's in the grave now.
Good.
The Google grave.
So then I'm going to ask you before we get started, because we didn't get a question specifically about this question. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you this, Garrett.
Okay.
Have you really played a tabletop role-playing game before? Or have you ever been interested in doing that, but just haven't been able to?
So I want you first to define a tabletop role-playing game in general, because we know, in general, board games.
Right.
But this is a specific set, a subset of board games that you take on a role, you take on a character, and maybe it will mostly you're in a team or you're facing against other players, real life players, in a board game fashion. Right.
Well, it's usually not PvP. A lot of times you are on the same team, kind of working together to kind of overcome other odds that are defined by the dungeon master. Because every time there's a tabletop role-playing game like this, there's a dungeon master that kind of tells the story,
Yeah.
Rules for the monsters, as well as, sets the mood and the tone, and kind of describes what's happening in the world. And while the other players kind of, have their own stat sheets for all their different characters. You pick kind of like a character with a character class, and you fill out the stat sheet based on what the tabletop RPG book that you buy outlines based
Mhm.
on the rules of the scenario. And you kind of go from there. So and there's been all kinds of tabletop role-playing games, and we're going to talk, of course, about kind of the franchises that started as tabletop games and then became video games. But there are lots of like video games or other properties that have become tabletop games over the years.
That's true. The
Like
other way
Magic the
around.
Gathering is like a pretty good example of this, where of course Wizards of the Coast, they own Dungeons and Dragons, but they also own
Yep.
Magic the Gathering. So they created a whole bunch of Dungeons and Dragons like scenarios for Magic the Gathering, and it plays very
It's
similarly
really cool.
to Dungeons and Dragons. You also had a lot of weird offshoots like tabletop role-playing games, because you've just had those over the years. I also think there's actually like a Last of Us tabletop role-playing game, as well as some other ones. So it's like
That's pretty
super
cool.
interesting and fun. So getting back to my original question, now that we've kind of described it, first of all, thank you so much for remembering to lay it out, because I totally forgot to do that. What have you ever really played a tabletop role-playing game? Or have you ever been interested in playing? Okay.
I have played a few, and it was really back in my college days. It was really before my PhD. I would say 2016, 2017 is really I got into some really D&D. I think it was the 5th edition, and it was fun. It's just I went through Dungeons and Dragons with a group of members. I remember having a game master or DM or dungeon master, whatever you want to call it. And what I noticed, going through these scenarios, it's like, man, a dungeon master needs to be on top of it. They got to be very prepared on what the scenario is, how to go through it, how can you manage it in a certain amount of time. Because these play sessions, guys, I would say at minimum 3 hours. At maximum, it could be like a whole day or a whole night, or however long you want to do it. So yeah, that's kind of the one biggest thing that really shout out to me. But I really love playing as the player. I took on some characters. I remember, I think I was a magician named Alfonso, and I was basically the archmage of the group, and going through. I remember being ridiculous too with the party. Like it was just me and my friends just having just having a good time, having some drinks, and we would just do the most the goofiest stuff in there and do so when you go through these scenarios, there's many different situations where, just like Fallout or Skyrim or whatever, mainly Obsidian, you got skill checks, right? You got these skill checks, and it's like, oh, you can charm away or you can sneak away or something like that. And I remember my one of my friends always wanted, he maximizes on charm skill or whatever that skill set is, and he tried to like be very charismatic and charm like even random monsters away. It was pretty funny. So
because you can talk like certain enemies, like if you run into bandits or something like that, if you use the charm skill, or if you have like high charm, you could or charisma, you could actually talk them out of killing you or having to even fight them at all, which is really interesting.
Yeah. And there's, the DM, whatever, I think they're really in control of how fun the situation can be, because they're managing the responses of like the situation itself, whether it be fighting monsters, whether it be secret items, or what's like making up stuff on the fly as well. What if a player is finding a passageway or whatever, they have to make stuff up on the fly. So yeah, that's my experience. It's just a couple, not too much of D&D. And then I've played some, I would say like, board game / role-playing game type of scenarios, where they have like a board game and rules and setup, but you take on a character, and that character has certain stats and whatever, and you kind of just go through a scenario or something like that. So I've played a few of those.
Yeah, because there's like, you can have like the big long journeys with characters that go on forever, or there a lot of times there's short scenarios that you can maybe do in an hour or two that are like
Yeah.
short contained stories where you basically have like preset characters, and then you don't worry too much about, having to do the long term stuff, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
True.
yeah.
What about you?
So as for me, I actually got my start in tabletop games when I was in grade 7. So this was a
Grade
long
7.
time ago. Like that would have been, oh my God,
11 or 12 years old, right?
well, that would have been 11 or 12 years old. So that would have been, 1995, 1996 is
Yeah.
around when I got started with some of these. Basically when my family moved back to Canada from Texas, we moved to a small town. And our next door neighbors had some friends around the neighborhood. And those kind of became our friends. And those were kind of the friends I had throughout high school. And
Nice.
we used to play a lot of video games because that's where we played N64 or Super Nintendo or played with Lego. But one of the things we really got into was advanced fighting fantasy. Garrett, I don't know if you've heard of this, but this is actually
No.
a British tabletop role-playing game that kind of originated there. But it wasn't really that popular, but it was very similar to D&D, but I think it was a little more loose with its rules than D&D. For example, we
Interesting.
would go on big long adventures. Like my friend Scott was the dungeon master, and then my brother Kyle, myself, and our friend Todd were kind of like the 3 players in the game. But what was interesting is that when we were building our characters, for example, we would build characters, but all of our races and classes would be randomized. So we would roll a dice, or depending on some of the classes, we would actually have to say like pick a number out of 200, because there'd be 200 classes in Advanced Fighting Fantasy, and then depending on what number you randomly pick, that's what you're playing as. Was kind of how we played that, and then you'd be stuck with that character for weeks upon weeks on end. So hopefully you randomly picked a character that you really liked. But we had so many fun adventures with like Scott was a really good DM. And he did a good job of kind of explaining the story and the scenery, and we had a lot of fun, sitting around and just having a ball playing AFF. I remember in one round, like where for 6 months I was playing as a half man, half pterodactyl berserker.
I love it.
And but so I would basically run in, and apparently I had this attack that was super overpowered where I could use my beak and like crush it into people's skulls.
So
and
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is this like half man, half pterodactyl, like split physically in half? Or
No,
is
I
this kind
had
of
like arms and the legs of a human, but I had wings.
How does that work? My
and the beak
goodness.
of a pterodactyl. Well, is it actually, Garrett, are you familiar with the X-Men at all?
I'm familiar with the X-Men, yes.
Okay, so there's a villain that they fight in the Savage Land storyline called Sauron. Not Sauron from Lord of the Rings, but Sauron the pterodactyl man. I was basically like that, essentially.
Okay. Sounds good.
You should look up Sauron from X-Men, because that would give you a pretty good visual distinction.
Got
from
it.
But also we did, there were stupid mistakes that I made where we were like, we had to fight this monster that was under the water. So we're like, well, Todd's character has the ability to take down the monster, and we can't hit it from here. So why don't we just toss Todd's character into the lake? And I'm sure he'll be able to swim and take down the monster. But when Todd rolled for initiative, his character couldn't swim. So he ended up drowning and losing his character because we didn't know that that's just how the way that things would break in that game.
Oh my goodness.
So yeah, like weird, crazy stuff would happen with Advanced Fighting Fantasy. And we had, again, that was a blast. We played that for years. And then after that, we started, getting more into D&D when I was in high school, like, grade 11, grade 12, OAC, aka grade 13 here in Canada.
You have a 13?
Yes, I went to grade 13, Garrett, because originally,
that's crazy.
Back in the day, Garrett, in Ontario, if you wanted to go to university, you had to do grade 13 in order to attend university. It was a requirement that the province had for whatever reason.
That is very interesting, because grade 12 for me felt like it was like pre-college or like getting into college. And it kind of makes sense because in the early 1900s, they actually expanded another year during the Great Depression just because of free meals for students. And that's why a grade 12 exists in the
Yeah.
US. But anyways, side
Yeah.
history. Keep on going.
Yeah. So like so grade 13 was a thing that I did because I at the time wanted to go to university and realized that was a dumb mistake and I should have just, left when in grade
It's
12
not
anyway.
always a dumb mistake, y'all. Okay. All right. Keep on going, Ryan.
It was for me because of the career I wanted to do at the time. It was better to go to college and I didn't know that at the time. So
Oh, got
because
it.
I wanted to go into television and broadcasting, which is what I do now.
Yeah.
But grade 30, but so I never had to go to grade 13 for that. But anyways, I digress. Going back to RPGs. So playing lots of D&Ds, I used to play as a human paladin because of course I was, righteous Garret. I like to follow the strict rules of the law. So of course our dungeon master would come up with all kinds of dumb scenarios where we'd be smuggling drugs or we would have to, help people do all these things that were very shady. And eventually I got to the point where I was like, I probably shouldn't be a paladin anymore. This was a mistake.
Well, I think you would transform yourself. You're not a paladin anymore. Well, maybe you're a paladin by class, but you are definitely rogue / mercenary type of vibe.
At that point, I would probably go towards Bloodguard, which is kind of like the Dark Knight kind of class in D&D.
Is that like a neutral evil type of thing going on? Or
yeah, it's more of like
neutral?
it's a lawful evil kind of thing. So like
lawful.
they're kind of like the Dark Paladins essentially.
Sweet, sounds good.
Yeah. So yeah, I played lots of D&D in high school, but yeah, like as an adult, I haven't really played D&D, but it's something that's always been, that's always fascinating me. But it's tough to get a group together. I know John 32 pointed out in the chat, of course, Stormcrow Manor here in Toronto, which is where I live. You can hire professional dungeon masters for individual parties. So if you have friends,
that's cool.
You can actually go to a place like Stormcrow Manor, and there's other places like that around town as well to do that at, where you can like rent a staff member to basically DM for you and kind of come up with, and
cool.
you provide them the scenario and they kind of run through it with you. So there are options out there for that, but it's just like I've never really got into that, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. So the one big scenario I went through I think it was late 2016, early 2017 was Curse of Strahd. It was a Dungeons and Dragons scenario. It has been revised for a number of years, and the DM did a pretty good job with the Curse of Strahd, and I was Alfonso in there, and I had I had pretty good magic, not gonna lie, but definitely struggled. That is a pretty hard. I thought it was a hard campaign. I know my friends now they do a lot of D&D because as you said, you need a group. And they have a group click going on, and it's actually much nicer now because you got online websites like Roll21, I think it's called Roll21.net. Let me check that real quick. I think
there's a bunch.
20.
None of that. There's other tools out there, but beyond that, even that you can that can help you out with.
Yeah. And so, during the pandemic, people just use these kind of websites to develop the scenario, and it actually does a pretty good job. You don't need be in person, have real life, like miniature figures or maps or whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, more than anything, I think it's really just the time commitment. I know for me, like that plays into it a little bit, where you have to really get have a group that comes together like every Friday night, as an example, for 4 or 5 hours to kind of play through it. Like that's like it
eats in to your video game time like no tomorrow. And I think that's the one thing that kind of deters me from it. Is like, man, I could be doing 5 hours of this. I don't know, like it's fun. And I think it would be really fun if I had a group of friends together that committed and do this. But man, I can do that 4 or 5 hours just chilling, watching TV or playing games or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, like at that point, you're kind of in control of your own time at that point, Garret. Like it makes sense. Like as you get older, especially like at my age, where it's just way tougher to try and commit to people to do that. As it is, like I mentioned this on Xbox Drive last week, but like I've been wishing and wanting to maybe get like a 4-player kind of committed group to playing Match of the Gathering every single week, doing like some Commander games, because I love playing Commander. But it's just one of those things where like there's not a lot of great online sources to do that. And it's just finding people to manage that time commitment that has been tough, which is why like in the community, I would love it if we could organize something like that. Just like, maybe if there was actually, hold on. Someone had a question about this. I want to bring this up real quick.
Go for it.
Oh, I must not have.
You missed out.
I must not have put it on here. Maybe, yes, because someone had asked about if we could actually come up with a carpool gaming community.
I did see that.
Like a group, like D&D.
I think it was crap. I did see that.
There are so many messages in the board about.
Oh, really?
Different things. It was Skinny Matt. Let me read Skinny Matt.
Skinny Matt, that's it. Yes.
Skinny Matt says, I've always been interested in diving into some D&D, especially since Preston has always wanted to play. I tried to do a character build with him, but with
the 5th edition,
yeah. But I had no idea what we were doing. Plus, I knew it'd be an issue trying to play due to having to modify any of the modules for only one player, since I've never really played myself. I never had to take advantage of the multiple local game stores that we have in the area to find a group. So I decided to get a reprint of Hero Quest because I played that over 25 years ago. Just going to say that I loved playing that as I watched my 8-year-old daughter smiling the entire time as we play Hero Quest. On that long note, are there any intentions of Carpool Gaming putting together a weekly or bi-weekly or monthly campaign for any tabletop games? I mean, honestly, if there was, like Skinny Matt, if there was the hunger out there from the Carpool Gaming faithful, if I heard from people that this is something they wanted, then it's something we could definitely try organizing. It's just one of those things where it'd probably have to be someone other than me who actually does the organizing of such a thing. But it is definitely something like if there's enough people that want to do it, we could certainly set something up and create a group within the Discord for doing something like that. So if that's something people would like, please hit me up and we will see about putting that together and putting a plan into action.
I wonder how good the online sources are these days. They're doing the just online play with these various tabletop role-playing games, because Roll20 was pretty good. Even the free version was a pretty good way of doing it. But yeah, as you said, it needs to, we need to have like a time. It is a commitment kind of thing, and it could be, as you said, monthly is probably more ideal than bi-weekly if people ever do that. But yeah, definitely open to it.
Yeah, it would be one of those things where it would probably have to be run mostly by the community. But if the community wants to, if there's enough hunger in the community for that, then that's certainly something that we can help put together for sure. But anyways, I'm also going to bring in Drellesh, who also asked a, well, not really had a question, but wanted to discuss some things here that based on the topic we just talked about. So Drellesh asked, have you guys ever indulged in lengthy advanced Dungeons and Dragons tabletop games? I used to play for many, many years as an elven archer, especially an arcane elven archer. That is where Drellesh actually comes from. So that we learn the origins of the name Drellesh, Garret, which is exciting. Have you ever been in the role of a dungeon master having to tell the story? Playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is where I developed my love for Oreos and playing till 1 a.m. with close friends every Wednesday for 3 or 4 years. I still have contact with all the quote unquote party members and our DM. Awesome memory. So yeah, Garret, you and I never really were DMs at all. Like
no, definitely not.
You gotta have the math skills, I think, to actually be a DM, let alone have a vivid imagination. And I think you and I are both probably really technical people. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, I'm not even joking too that it is like a part-time job with that DM type of commitment, especially if you do it weekly. Like, man, you gotta set that thing up. Like with a scenario book, I think it's better. But man, if you don't have a scenario book,
especially because you have to factor that into actually putting a tabletop role-playing game thing together is getting all the books and the materials that you need, which can actually be costly nowadays. Because they've continued to go up in price kind of over the years.
I want to explain a little bit more of just the intricacies of what these scenarios are like. Imagine I'm just gonna build up a scenario just like in people's head. Just imagine you're a player right now. You're kind of joining together in a random town. Maybe you're a mercenary group, or whatever. And this mercenary group has been hired to kind of guard this caravan of like treasure or whatever. You go to the tavern. There's a bunch of mini characters. The DM has to make up what their personalities are, if they're hostile or friendly, and what kind of associations they are with. And then boom, there's robbers coming in, and then you have to figure out how to react to those robbers in a certain amount of time. And then maybe you run away, and then you take off with a caravan. Maybe the whole town lights on fire. That's the kind of stuff that happens in a DM story. It's just situation after situation. There are stats in each of these characters that the DM builds up. There are skill checks of sneaking away, of charming a person, of like, I don't know, transforming
just
a person into a mop. Even to attack.
Because if you miss, like, what if you miss, or you roll for initiative and you get a low initiative score, and you're last in the turn order, and all the monsters go before you? Like, and not only that, there's also placement of your characters as well, because usually the DM will have like this little map of the battleground that they have to kind of plan out, well, where is everyone kind of positioned? Because if you're a melee character, like if you're a fighter, you have to use your movement stat to then get close to the enemy. And if you're not fast enough, then you won't be able to get there in one turn, so you might not be able to attack. There's a lot of things in play when it comes to this stuff. Or it's actually like in D&D, if you're a wizard, you have to worry about the area of effect on some of your spells.
Area of effect, for sure.
Because normally in a role-playing game, you don't worry too much about that because there's not friendly fire. But in D&D, there's friendly fire.
There is.
So
there definitely is.
If your mage casts a firebolt and your enemy is here and your two melee guys are right next to him, all three of them get hit with the same amount of damage, which is kind of ridiculous. So there's some crazy stuff that you have to consider with D&D. But
definitely.
But no, DMing is like too complicated for my pigeon brain to kind of handle at this point.
Yeah.
Also, I love Garden's comment here. This whole episode sounds like a foreign language to me, but I'm enjoying it. Well, also part of it, we haven't really gotten to video games yet. So, Garret, 38 minutes into the episode, we'll finally start talking
into the role-playing game, the tabletop role-playing game video games.
We'll actually talk about video games now. It'll be great.
Okay.
This is the RPG cave, of course, where we talk about video games all the time, I swear. So first up, we're going to start with the biggest tabletop role-playing game franchise in the world, Dungeons and Dragons, of course. They've got multiple movies, one that was terrible and one that's actually pretty good. But then, of course,
remember that one.
You also got lots and lots of video games to choose from D&D. In fact, the very first D&D game was Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Cloudy Mountain, which was on Intellivision. It came out in 1982. And it was an action RPG where you play as like a warrior and you explore these maps that kind of like that have like fog of war on them. So like as you progress through the caves and the dungeons and whatnot, like it reveals more and more of the dungeon to you, which is pretty cool. And there was it also got a sequel on the Intellivision a year later as well. And I remember like Garret, do you remember the Intellivision Amico, when the Intellivision Amico was coming back a few years ago?
No.
Okay.
Definitely
so
not.
Intellivision, the IP was bought by Tommy Tallarico, famous video game musician, and he wanted to bring back the Intellivision name. So they were creating a console called the Intellivision Amico, which was going to bring back a lot of old Intellivision IP. And one of them was actually that they showed off when they announced the console was a sequel to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Cloudy Mountain from the 1982 game. They were apparently going to do a sequel to it, which was going to be so weird. They showed it off and it looked terrible. And that console never came out because it was kind of terrible. But that's a whole other video. Maybe that's a Pitch Shop retro gaming video at some point. But, we also, of course, have a big series in video games, the Baldur's Gate series, which of course originated from Dungeons and Dragons, because Baldur's Gate is a location in Dungeons and Dragons. It's like a fairly big city. And you know, the original Baldur's Gate games were actually where BioWare got their start, because those were games on PC. And they wanted to basically give you the most accurate translation of Dungeons and Dragons possible in like a turn-based, you know, PC kind of like top-down isometric view kind of way. So
Yes.
that's what those games very much were, much beloved games, great storytelling in those games, really, really good games. But we've talked about it on the show before, Garrett. I'm not really into CRPGs, so it was tough for me to get into them, but the storytelling on display in Baldur's Gate was really, really cool. And it had like, if you were familiar with Dungeons and Dragons at all, like there are reoccurring characters in Dungeons and Dragons, and a lot of those reoccurring characters would appear in Baldur's Gate, like Minx and Boo, as example. Like Minx, of course, the ranger with his little pet hamster that he can make really, really big.
Nice. Sounds good. Yeah, I'm with you. These CRPGs are not like the top of my video game repertoire. I mean, we're gonna go through the list some more, so I'll just wait till I say I play some more. But yeah, it is definitely not my strong suit. I do want to play some more though. I know, I do have Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 on Steam just because it's been,
well, they just
bundled
re-released
up with the
them.
package. Oh, okay, cool.
They re-released those like a couple years ago. Like, in fact, a lot of these games I'm going to talk about in the D&D category all got re-releases because I think like Embracer Group owns all of them. So I think they did the re-releases on all these.
I think it was even before Embracer Group. It was a random studio that has these rights, and they just re-enhanced them for the Switch.
Yeah,
or something.
Because originally they came to mobile, and then they came to Switch afterwards. That was kind of how they did it, and then PC as well as other consoles. Because these are also on Xbox and PS5 as well. But
okay.
We also have so of course, if the original Baldur's Gate, if you don't like CRPGs, they branched out by doing Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance 1 and 2. These are action RPGs on the original Xbox and the PlayStation 2. And then those also got re-releases by, of course, Embracer Group, THQ Nordic, like pretty recently on all consoles and PC. They're fun games to go back to, and they were great games at the time, but they haven't really aged the best. And they don't really have like the level of storytelling that the original Baldur's Gate games did. But I think they were like fun Diablo-esque kind of clones.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And of course, we got Baldur's Gate 3 coming out in August and September. And of course, Ribble Rabo asks, speaking of D&D, will you guys be playing Baldur's Gate 3 by chance? So, Garrett, I think of the Carpool Gaming staff, you are for sure the only 100% committed to this game at this point.
Yeah, I'm interested in this for sure. I did like the recent games like Divinity, Original Sin. I did play quite a bit of that, like a couple of years ago, and I liked the style of it. So yeah, I would totally be down trying it out if given the chance.
Yeah. Whereas I'm like, I'm on the fence because there's a lot of stuff coming out, and I would want to play it on console. I probably wouldn't want to play this on PC. So the PlayStation version of Baldur's Gate 3 comes out the same day as Starfield comes out, Garrett. So
yeah, that's unacceptable. Yeah,
it's gonna be tough. That it might get pushed to the wayside, unfortunately, because like as excited as I am to maybe play it this year, it comes out the same day as Starfield, Garrett. I can't do it. I'm not going to buy it on PC because I can play it early. I'm not going to do that. Like I will play other games instead.
That's okay. Yeah. It'll eventually go on sale, just like everything else. These games do go on sale quite often too. So like give it a year and like they'll be half price and you can get Baldur's Gate 3 for And let me tell you, they are packed with content. Like I'm sure Baldur's Gate 3 is probably the most out of all of them. But man, when I was going through like Divinity, I was just like, dang, this amount of content throughout the whole game is just like, it's pretty insane how much dialogue there is.
You say this, but Baldur's Gate 2, Shadows of Alm, if you go on How Long to Beat Garrett, is like an 80-hour game. So
that's unimaginable.
Yeah, and that's
like a Persona game.
Yeah, and that's like a 2000s game, like an early 2000s game. So yeah, and a lot of content in it. But
crazy.
That's part of the reason why it's like the Baldur's Gate games are known for content. And Yarden, of course, points out, but Ryan, you have an awesome PC. I do, but I don't want to play the game on my PC. I would rather play it on console, if I'm being honest. So
interesting.
I have my own personal reasons for what I need to do that. But
okay. Yeah, I feel like these games are gonna be right at home for me on the laptop / Steam Deck. Like, okay, I can play some on the big screen. Okay, I can just take it on the couch and go through some random side quests and stuff like that. Yeah.
Although I am worried about Steam Deck after hearing about the split screen stuff with Series S, how they can't get it to run on there. So I'm like, if it's that unoptimized on Series S, I wonder how it'll actually run on Steam Deck. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I think that's more of a. I mean, like, I don't know. So
yeah, I guess we'll find out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did mess with my Steam Deck a little bit where the VRAM is higher.
Okay.
And I think, it's also, just they've been developing on PC for the longest time. I'm sure they, can have some lower settings and more optimized for the processors there instead of like whatever the specific set the Series S is. But you're right. It could be it may not run on day one for sure.
Yeah, for sure. All right, next up. So we got the Baldur's Gate series, but then we've also got the Mystara series, which was kind of like the early 90s D&D kind of
you just made up
realms here. Of
think.
course I did.
Yeah.
So, of course, that led to a couple of key releases. One of them being Dungeons and Dragons: Warriors of the Eternal Sun on the Sega Genesis in 1992. This was very much kind of like the inspiration for Baldur's Gate in a way, where it was like a top-down, isometric, turn-based, very, very D&D rules specific role-playing game, which was really interesting. I played this actually back in the day on Sega Channel, and it's interesting. It's very much like when you compare that to Baldur's Gate, it's like, well, this is definitely where they got the inspiration for that from. So, but I won't dive too much longer into it because it's like an old Genesis games, but I will talk about these. We got Dungeons and Dragons Tower of Doom and Dungeons and Dragons Shadows over Mystara. These came out in 1994 and 1996 respectively, and these were arcade games based off D&D. These were beat 'em up RPGs because Garrett, you remember Dragon's Crown?
Yes.
Okay, so similar to Dragon's Crown, these were side-scrolling beat 'em up games like a Streets of Rage with RPG elements. You would level up your characters, you would give your characters new skills, you would have branching paths in the levels, and depending on which branching path you would go on, you'd fight different enemies and different bosses. You had equipment, you had all these things that made these games role-playing games, but also beat 'em up games at the same time. And these were kind of like the inspiration for a game like Dragon's Crown. This is also one of those, whenever someone asks me, Garrett, about underrated gems on a console like the Xbox 360, this is one of the games I point to because they did a re-release of these two arcade games on Xbox 360 on Xbox Live Arcade, and they always go on sale all the time for like $2. And it's backwards compatible with Series X, so people can actually still play these today. And they're very, very fun role-playing games. They also came to Sega Saturn back in the day as well. But these are games that if people have a Series X now and you like beat 'em up
developed by
Capcom,
games,
these games are really good. So if you have a Series X and you like if you liked a game like Dragon's Crown, I actually recommend these wholeheartedly. They're really, really good. But
cool.
Moving on, in the 2000s, D&D wanted to kind of branch out and create Forgotten Realms, which was this whole other setting that D&D kind of took place in. And we got a bunch of games based off the Forgotten Realms kind of location, and including Icewind Dale, which came out in 2000. That was pretty much in the similar style as Baldur's Gate, but made by Obsidian rather than BioWare. And we also got Neverwinter Nights in 2002, which again was created by BioWare, but it was more of a 3D third-person game that you could then zoom the camera up to have an overhead perspective. So it was kind of
interesting.
It was kind of splitting between those two styles of games. And also, like, Neverwinter Nights has a huge mod scene behind it, Garrett. Even to this day, people still actually make mods for Neverwinter Nights because
good for them.
Because the developers at BioWare kind of really opened up the game and allowed you to create your own custom scenarios for Neverwinter Nights. So there's actually like a pretty popular scene behind this game, despite the fact that it came out in 2002. It's so long ago.
Over 20 years ago, guys, just letting you know.
Yeah. And this is also one of those games that got even like a modern remaster from THQ Nordic as well, around the same time that those other Baldur's Gate releases came out. Yeah.
Yes.
A lot of people have these on Steam probably because they've probably come up in 1 million Steam sales at this point.
I have these on Switch. They've been on sale on Switch for quite a while. And before I had a Steam Deck, I got this, and I think like bundled in for like with other classic games for like $5 or something like that.
Yeah. The only thing the Switch version is missing is all the mods, because you can only do that on the PC version. But that's kind of been like, in a lot of ways, for people, that's kind of been their D&D simulator, is playing through Neverwinter Nights, but you play by yourself rather than having to, play other stuff. Next up, we got Forgotten Realms Demon Stone. This came out in 2004. It was an action RPG on the original Xbox, and it was an okay game. It was fine. It was fun. Whatever. But then Neverwinter Nights 2 came out in 2006, and it was the very much, in the same style as the original one. But for whatever reason, people weren't drawn to it in the way that they were with the first game, because they made a bunch of changes to it where you couldn't mod it as easily, and just it wasn't really a big hit, unfortunately. But then I got to give this game a shout out next. This is a game that I've never played before, but people talk about this game all the time as one of the best CRPGs of all time, and it's gotten a re-release pretty recently as well, and that's Planescape Torment. This is in the kind of the D&D universe, and it's got its own kind of unique story, but it also is a CRPG, plays very similar to the Baldur's Gate games. It has like a really good story as well, but I've never played it, but I hear nothing but great things about Planescape Torment. Like, it's a game that I hear people talk about all the time on their like top 25 games of all time lists. It's that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I think Planescape and Neverwinter Nights was a bundled thing.
Yeah.
I actually have to check.
Yeah, I know they bundled a bunch of these together, and I think these two were bundled together. Or Icewind Dale was bundled with a lot of these too. But Garrett, while you look that up, we'll fast forward in time to the newest release in the Dungeons and Dragons universe, because honestly, Garrett, after 2006, D&D games kind of went quiet, where we just didn't have a lot of new Dungeons and Dragons video games. And it wasn't really until like last year we got our first one in a long time, which was Dark Alliance 3. So they just called it Dungeons and Dragons Dark Alliance 3 rather than Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance 3. But man, that game was terrible. It was honestly one of the worst games from last year. So
I heard it's pretty bad.
Yeah. And they've never gone back to D&D since, which is weird to think about, because D&D, I think now, is more popular than it's ever been. Been in the past, like especially with shows like Critical Role on YouTube, which is very, very popular nowadays. Like I'm surprised that they never went back and made more D&D video games. But.
Well, I think it's maybe they're looking at the current landscape, and I'm just like, who are the people that are in charge of Dungeons and Dragons again?
Wizards of the Coast, so Hasbro.
Wizards of the Coast. I'm sure they're looking at their past and looking at the video game development right now. It's like, that looks insane. We're just gonna keep with our current Magic the Gathering / Dungeons and Dragons, and then you know what they do? They contract their IP, to other developers. So they just like, okay, just let them do that, and then that'll be that.
That's how we got that G.I. Joe hero shooter that came out a couple of years ago, Garrett. I don't know if you remember that. Like G.I. Joe.
I've heard of that.
Blackout. Man, that game is not good either.
Update on the Switch. Yes. So Planescape Torment and Icewind Dale Enhanced Editions. That's bundled together. And Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 Enhanced Editions are bundled together on the Switch right here.
And it's important to note that the Enhanced Editions of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 come with the expansions as well, which also is like another 50 hours of content for each of those games. So, yeah. In fact, I don't know if you've ever seen the PC version of the original Baldur's Gate, specifically with its manual, because the manual for Baldur's Gate 1 was this. It was no lie this thick.
Had 7 books.
That's like Mark, 7 books worth of stuff for the audio listeners. It was ridiculous. It was like 400 or 500 pages, and it was like a tall book. It wasn't even like the book itself, Garrett, was like this tall, like 8.5 by 11 pages or taller, which is ridiculous.
Insane.
Yeah. The only thing that rivaled it was a strategy game in the Star Wars universe, Star Wars Rebellion, that I got back in the day, where the manual for that game was legit 1,000 pages. which was ridiculous. That game was so complicated. In fact, it's on Steam now because they did a re-release of it. But the game is so complicated that like people have no idea how to play it nowadays. If you actually, but
that's hilarious.
There's kind of the short history of D&D games. There's also, there was like a Tiger electronic handheld D&D game, as well as some other, PC only releases back on like DOS back in the day for D&D. But, I wanted to keep it at least a little bit short when discussing D&D, because we got to talk about some of these other tabletop franchises, Garrett, that you might be less familiar with, because these are the more obscure franchises. First up, we got Vampire the Masquerade, which, by the way, as soon as Seth saw the thumbnail and saw that Vampire the Masquerade was going to be discussed on tonight's podcast, he kind of flipped out a little bit because he got very excited.
Okay. He's a big fan of that. Cool.
Yes.
Awesome.
So Vampire the Masquerade, similar to Dungeons and Dragons, there's a separate company. And they did a bunch of different, I think they're called White Wolf Entertainment, and they do a bunch of different tabletop games. So they have Vampire the Masquerade here, as well as another one we're going to talk about later. And Vampire the Masquerade is about this world that's kind of ruled by vampires, where, and you basically play as a vampire in Vampire the Masquerade, as kind of the name alludes to. And you live in this world, in this society ruled by vampires, and there's a bunch of different factions and a lot of like political intrigue. So it's actually a really interesting franchise, which leads to some really interesting games. Of course, the first game in the series is Vampire the Masquerade Redemption, which came out in 2000 on PC. This was a very similar to Baldur's Gate. It was kind of like a very CRPG style game. It was a game that most people forgot existed. It was popular at the time because the Vampire the Masquerade was a pretty popular franchise when it came out in the mid 80s. And it just got more and more popular over time. But the hidden gem, Garrett, or the game that everyone points to with this franchise when it comes to video games, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which came out in 2004. This was originally supposed to come out on console, but it only came out on PC. And this is actually a Fallout style or Elder Scroll style game in the Vampire the Masquerade universe, where again, you create your own vampire, you decide which of the factions you want to join, and then you do all these quests and go on these adventures and explore the world of Vampire the Masquerade. Like it's this really underrated Vampire the Masquerade game that a lot of people actually still go back to and play today. Like it's actually a pretty popular game amongst streamers or people that are just into Vampire the Masquerade. And it's received a ton of mods over the years, of course, because it's on PC. But it's a pretty cool game, Garrett. Like I played it back in the day and really enjoyed it. And we'll talk about and I will say nowadays, probably for people who haven't played before, it's tough. It's a tough game for people who didn't play it back then to play now. But luckily, there's going to be a solution in place that we'll get to in just a second, because after 2004. There weren't really any Vampire the Masquerade games until 2022, when we got Vampire the Masquerade Blood Hunt, which was a battle royale game in the Vampire the Masquerade universe.
It came out last year.
I don't know if you remember this game, Garrett, but no one.
I remember Vampire the Masquerade being shown off like a few years ago, and that's the Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, I guess. And I remember seeing a trailer and like people being very, very excited for this. I remember some noise about Vampire the Masquerade last year, but I did not know this was the a battle royale game that came out last year.
It was definitely a game that came out last year and nobody played it, so it got shut down pretty quickly. But there's another reason why people were excited about Vampire the Masquerade last year, Garrett. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 was announced at the Xbox Showcase last year as like an Xbox timed exclusive. I think it's supposed to be Game Pass day and date. And very similar to Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, it's going to be like an Elder Scrolls or Fallout style game in the Vampire the Masquerade universe, where you play as a vampire and you go and explore and do all these quests. And you pick your faction and there's like political intrigue. Like it seems pretty cool. And I'm pretty excited for when this game comes out. Unfortunately, there's no release date because it was originally actually supposed to come out at the beginning of this year and it got delayed indefinitely. So we don't have like when I say delayed indefinitely, it got changed from 2023 to TBD. So who knows? What's going on.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Well, who's developing it?
Focus Home Entertainment.
Like they are the developer too.
Oh, sorry. There's a developer under them. I don't remember it off the top.
Okay.
Of my head. For the look.
Hold on, I'm looking this up. Bloodlines 2. Let's see here. Hard Suit Labs, and the publisher is Paradox Interactive. Actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
go.
Hard.
Oh yeah,
Suit
Focus
Labs.
Home did the battle royale. That's why I got confused.
Oh, okay. Okay, so okay, yeah, they don't. Hard Suit Labs doesn't have that much. It looks like of a repertoire. It's just within the Paradox Interactive kind of umbrella. So,
and the trailer they showed before at the Xbox showcase was a cinematic trailer, so we didn't really get to see any of the gameplay. But this is a game that, from what they talked about in interviews afterwards, and from what I know of the pedigree of the original game and how it sounds like they understand why people like that original game, I think this is a game that people should have on their radar when we do find out when it's coming out. Because again, if you like Bethesda style games and you also like playing as vampires, like this is going to be a no-brainer kind of a game.
I think it's going to be one to look at because it's definitely like, if you look up on the Steam page, it is under the Paradox Interactive, developed and published by, and they've made some pretty awesome simulation games. Like Crusader Kings 3, City Skylines. They have Stellaris, so they understand how to build lore and how to tell it. So I'll be interested in this actually and see how this goes.
And I wanted to make sure to point this out too, because I knew this would be the type of game that when Garret actually sees how this plays, that you'd actually probably be really interested in. So, okay. But of course, Seth hops in with a question, of course, because that kind of rounds out the list of Vampire the Masquerade games. But Seth has a question about Vampire the Masquerade, and Garret, you're probably not going to be able to answer this question because you've never played it before,
no, but I'm good.
Seth asks, what is the best Vampire the Masquerade clan, and why is it Nosferatu? So in the world of Vampire the Masquerade, Garret, because this world is ruled by vampires, there's a bunch of different factions, as I mentioned. And depending on the style of vampire you are, you usually belong to that type of faction. So the Nosferatu are kind of like the physically disfigured vampires. Like they're almost like the classic like bat-like vampires that you've seen in movies or literature before, where when you look at them, you're like, okay, that's definitely a vampire when you look at them. Because they're like disfigured, or they have back like features and stuff like that. But I'm going to disagree with you, $2 Hero, because if I want to be a vampire, I want to show off. I want to be like, I want to show us some class here. I don't want to be just this, street rat kind of vampire that looks all gross and stuff. No, I don't want to do that.
Throwing shade. There you go, Seth.
To be fair, that's kind of what happens because I normally play as part of the Toreador faction, and they are kind of like the divas or the artistes, if you would, of the vampire faction, where they're more all about their powers are based on seduction or charming your enemies. So like they're very good at bending people's wills to their own in a lot of ways. Like I kind of like that a little bit. Also, I like the idea of just like coming up with like being an artist and just painting in blood. Just sounds like fun if you're a vampire. So
yeah, that sounds pretty fun.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or the other faction I kind of side with is Gangrel, and they're more like beast-like vampires. Like they kind of like are taken over by their vampire-like instincts. So they're more beast than man. Because I like that idea where you're almost like a feral vampire at that point.
I like these. Yeah. I like these factions. I like how different they are. I wish that amount of creativity was in the enemy design for Redfall. Just letting you know.
Of course.
The Redfall vampires.
Those are only like 3 of like 15 factions in Vampire.
That's crazy.
They're all like super unique and interesting. So yeah, it's a universe that's really cool that I just wish we got more games in. But luckily that's going to change pretty soon. Unless you want to go play a battle royale game right now that no one's playing, Garret, we can go do that. But
it's free to play.
Of course. Next up, we got Werewolf the Apocalypse. This is also made by White Wolf Entertainment. But we only really have one game in that series, which is Werewolf the Apocalypse Earthblood, which came out in 2021. This was definitely a Focus Home Entertainment game, and it was not good. But it's like the Werewolf the Apocalypse RPG is very similar to Vampire the Masquerade, but instead of vampires, it's werewolves. is kind of the idea.
Okay.
So there's like different werewolf factions, but the world's not unlike Vampire the Masquerade. Like werewolves don't rule the world, but they kind of exist in the shadows of society. But there's a bunch of different werewolf factions trying to vie for power in the kind of the underworld. So again, it's a really interesting tabletop game that I think would make like an interesting video game. But we only had one game that came out a couple of years ago. That was the first time they ever adapted it, and it was not very good.
I heard of this game, actually. I remember seeing it coming and going.
Yeah, there were a lot of advertisements for this game before it came out, because Werewolf the Apocalypse is actually a pretty popular IP, just like Vampire the Masquerade is. So
okay, I remember like, what is this game? And the reviewers are like, don't worry about it. And I'm like, okay, sounds good.
Yeah, exactly.
That's very much what I heard. Yeah.
Well, a much better IP. And this tabletop game started in the late 80s. It's based off the book, like the works of Edgar Allan Poe, of all things. We got Call of Cthulhu, which you might have heard of before, Garrett.
Yes, I've heard of this one.
There are multiple Call of Cthulhu video games based off the tabletop game. Of course, the first game in the series, Call of Cthulhu: Shadow of the Comet, came out on PC in 1993. This is basically like a text adventure that takes place in the Call of Cthulhu franchise. But the game that a lot of people know from this franchise is Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth. This came out on the original Xbox and the PC in 2005. And this was kind of like, almost like Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, but this was like an open world RPG similar to like that, what you would get from something like The Witcher or a Bethesda style RPG, where it was first person. You did a bunch of quests and stuff like that, and it was kind of this open world game, which was really interesting. But then we got a reboot many years later. Call of Cthulhu came back just as Call of Cthulhu on modern consoles. So this is on Xbox One and PlayStation 4. This came out in 2018, and it got okay reviews. People thought it was okay, but it's certainly it's like, I've never really been into Call of Cthulhu, but I know a lot of people actually really like this franchise. But it's never really had, like, again, a good set of video games. I think Dark Corners of the Earth is probably the best one, but they're all kind of hit or miss at this point.
Got it.
Yeah. But then next one, Garrett, I don't know if you've heard of this franchise before. Cyberpunk.
Never heard of it.
Have you heard of Cyberpunk before, Garrett?
I heard it's a indie darling to many. It's very small, but very successful coming out, within recent years. Made by the small indie developer that is
CJ Project Red.
The Project Red. Yes, Project Red. They also made the very small, very like literally the size of it small of the Witcher series. Yes.
Of course. Yeah.
Yes.
So Cyberpunk, most people don't know, but Cyberpunk 2077 is actually based off a tabletop game called Cyberpunk, and it plays similarly to D&D, but it's in the Cyberpunk universe, like the far future universe, where you have like character classes based off, far future cyberpunky kind of stuff, similar to what you play in Cyberpunk 2077, the video game. But this was more of an obscure one, where honestly, I didn't know the tabletop game existed until they announced Cyberpunk 2077, the game.
Yeah.
Whereas I saw a lot of people freaking out at the initial trailer for Cyberpunk, because of the fact that they knew the tabletop game, but I knew nothing about this, because I think Cyberpunk as a tabletop game was pretty popular in Europe, but not popular here in North America.
Got it.
Yeah.
Sounds
kind of like AFF was, but of course, Cyberpunk, probably one of the best tabletop role-playing video games we've ever played.
Yes. Of these games that you have mentioned, Cyberpunk 2077 is like, okay, I'll play that one compared to the rest of them.
Yeah. And then, of course, Garrett, to kind of round out our conversation, I've got a list of video games that were very much inspired by tabletop games, but don't actually have their own tabletop games, except for fan creations, of course. We've got Star Wars: Knights of the Republic, the original Fallout games, Disco Elysium, Pillars of Eternity, Divinity: Original Sin, and of course, Dragon Age Origins. All these were kind of like based around the ideas that came from other, tabletop games, but they weren't actually based off tabletop games themselves. But
the Pillars of Eternity kind of transferred over. There's like board games and card games of Pillars of Eternity now. Yeah,
exactly. Because there's also, and we got a question about this later, but we have like The Witcher has a tabletop game now. Fallout does. Like a lot of these games here that I mentioned all have tabletop games now based on these games that were then inspired by tabletop games when they were being created in the first place, which is just really interesting to think about. The snake kind of eating its own tail there when it comes to that stuff.
So pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's all the games.
That's all the games, Garrett. It was a big list. A lot to go through.
Big list.
But yeah, definitely this was kind of, again, like a surface level discussion on tabletop role-playing games. But we'll talk about some of these more in the future, I think, as time goes on. But let's party up, Garrett, because we got some questions about this topic.
Let's go.
Let's start with I Can't See, who says, I've never played a pen and paper role-playing game. The closest thing I ever played was the text adventure and a mud MMO. And I've never played a mud MMO. I don't actually know what that is. But
I don't know what that is either.
Text adventures are definitely like close to what would make sense as far as like if you were playing like a role, like a D&D style game, because everything's told to you in text and described to you as if you can't really see anything. Because I used to play those back in the day on billboard services. Of course, this just shows how old I am. Connecting with my 14.4 modem and to the internet to billboard services, and which had like, you know, different text adventures on them. And it'd be like, oh, you're going on this venture. You see a field. What do you do? And you say, go forward. And then it tells you what happens when you go forward. And you basically do that for 8 hours, which is exciting.
Got it. So MUD MMOs are very similar to text-based adventures, only it's multiplayer. So it's multi-user dungeon. And now it's called like a multiplayer real-time virtual world. And I guess they made up their own content and stuff. I've never heard of this. This is super interesting.
Well, I was gonna say, like, this would have definitely been before your time. Like, this is like the type of thing where like I played some of these when I was in, you know, in like 1995, Garrett. It's when I played some of this stuff. Like, this is when it was popular. Before
I was a baby back then, so sense.
you were definitely too young, I think, for some of this stuff. Next up, we got Darth Stridius, who says, I love D&D. You've played it before. If you could take a video game that doesn't have a tabletop version, which game would you want a tabletop version of? So I actually have two that I think would be really interesting. One, of course, is kind of like my most obvious pick, and that is Mass Effect. I actually would love
that would be great.
A tabletop game based off Mass Effect, because I think that's a slam dunk of an idea right there. You've already kind of got the factions in place with Mass Effect. You've also already got kind of the character classes from the games that you can kind of create your character classes with in the tabletop game. I'm sure there's a million scenarios you could come up with in the Mass Effect universe. I think that just is like home run, slam dunk kind of
there you go.
Kind of an idea. But the other idea I actually had, and I'll go to you, Garrett, is Metal Gear Solid, which is not a role-playing game, but I think it would be interesting to see like a stealth take on a tabletop role-playing game where you can play as like a group of, you know, agents, almost like Metal Gear Online in a way, where you kind of have like a shared objective where you all kind of have to be kind of stealthy. I think that would be make for a really interesting role-playing game where it really like, I think like that your chances of evading the camera, for example, and rolling for initiative to see if you avoid the camera would be like really interesting and cool. So
a sneaky board game. I haven't seen too much of those.
Yeah. Well, again, it wouldn't be a board game. It'd be a tabletop experience where you'd have a dungeon master kind of doing all that stuff. So like, I think it would work better outside the parameters of a board game itself. Because I think actually Metal Gear does have a board game. In fact, I'm going to look that up right now. But I want to hear your answers while I look this up, Garrett.
Oh man, you know me. Like I would like to, I would really like to play like a Fallout like tabletop game. I'm sure they exist out there. Many different scenarios. I think I would play more of like, let's say, Fallout 4 like or Fallout 76 lore centered around a tabletop game more than the game itself. I would love to, because I like the aspect, the time of that game, the history of Fallout is very interesting as well. People don't know it's an alternative history timeline, and in very Americana, like early 1950s 60s style, but it's set in the future. It is very bizarre, very weird. What could have happened? Yeah, I would definitely be into that. I wouldn't care for an Elder Scrolls tabletop just because Dungeons and Dragons kind of covers it.
Yeah, like it'd be
and
very
more.
similar.
Yeah. So I would say first and foremost a Fallout, maybe a smaller indie game. I would love a Nobody Saves the World. I wouldn't say a tabletop game, but more of a board game. That would be like a simple, silly board game that you could just go through and have random cards. Have you played Munchkin?
I have played
I'm curious.
Munchkin.
Yeah, so very similar to that, where you could pick up cards and like based on the cards, you could take different forms and like Nobody Saves the World. I would like something more like that versus a tabletop game. But yeah, those are my choices.
That'd be pretty
For
cool.
sure.
Yeah, Munchkin's actually a really fun game if people have never played it.
I was very addicted to that. So those were the two biggest ones. It was Dungeons and Dragons, and then also Munchkin that I played a lot with friends. Yeah.
Yeah, like when I first moved to Toronto, my roommate, she was like obsessed with Munchkin, so we ended up playing like almost every night. And then the nights we didn't play that, we were playing Magic the Gathering or something else instead. We were a very nerdy household. You must understand.
There you go.
Yes, Munchkin was played a lot. And actually, Garrett, to answer your question, there is a Metal Gear Solid board game where that does have stealth, where you can hide in a cardboard box and everything. And it even comes with a replica. It even comes with like a little replica cardboard boxes, and of course a replica Metal Gear as well. That's bigger than all the other figures, which is really interesting.
Nice. Sounds good.
All right. Next question comes to us from Nagachaka, and now we've actually transitioned out of tabletop games, Garrett. Nagachaka asks, which paper-themed RPG from the GameCube needs to be remastered for the Nintendo Switch, and why is it Paper Mario with a 1,000-Year Door? Well, Nagachaka, you didn't give us a lot of room for other alternative answers.
Yeah, you kind of just like narrowed it. And then when he said from the GameCube, well,
well, there you go. I mean, obviously the correct answer, Garrett, is Paper Mario Color Splash, because we need Color Splash to come back. Even though we don't, that's actually a terrible answer. Because actually Sticker Star is the better answer, right? No. Sticker Star is bad too. Yes, of course, Paper Mario 1,000-Year Door. Of course. I think folks who are audio listeners, of course, Garrett was just like, this was a mistake. I could tell on the look on his face that this was
I need to play the original Paper Mario game on Nintendo 64, Nintendo Switch Online. It's there. It's ready to play. Yeah.
It's right there.
And then I'll play 1,000-Year Door. And then we still got the best RPG from the GameCube already being remastered this year. That is Baten Kaitos 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Together remastered.
You like them more than that by saying that, Garrett,
kidding. I'm messing
that means you like them more than Fire Emblem Path of Radiance or Tales of Symphonia, which of
I haven't played those.
Okay, because those are like people's favorite RPGs on the GameCube. But they're
okay. Okay.
But Paper Mario 1,000-Year Door is a really good game, Nagachaka. One day we'll get it, but I think they'll actually, to Garrett's point, I actually think that it's more likely that they actually remaster or remake the original Paper Mario maybe instead first before they do 1,000-Year Door. But we'll see. I mean, it's on Switch Online, so who knows? Nintendo's a weird company. I never thought they were going to remaster or remake
Metroid
Super Mario RPG, but they did.
That's true.
Also,
they did.
Also, Rybo brings up a game I forgot, Skies of Arcadia. I think of that more of as a Dreamcast game than a GameCube game, so that's why I forgot about it when talking about GameCube games. Because that game has always been so expensive on GameCube that I've never actually seen a copy in person, and that's like $1,000 game. So I will never play it on GameCube.
My goodness, you can get a PC with that. Like, come on, guys. And then you just get Skies of Arcadia if you try hard enough. Just laying it up.
But I think there are ways, Garrett. I think there are ways.
There are ways.
All right, last question of the week comes to us from Yarden, who says, Ryan, after Garrett finishes Final Fantasy 16, what is your personal recommendation for the next Final Fantasy he should play? Also, Parasite Eve is not a Final Fantasy game, so you can't pick that. Of course, this is in direct response, Garrett, to the poll that you posted over on Twitter. And actually, we should go check on the voting for that real quick, because we got.
I wonder if it's done. Let me check, actually.
17 hours left, Garrett. So
yeah, I think it's basically done though. We got
I don't know, you got 237 votes, man.
Yeah, it's been slow. It's been slower like the past day. So I'm just gonna say it out loud. The 4 choices. It's Final Fantasy VII Remake, Final Fantasy VII Classic, Final Fantasy 12, and then other. I wish I had more options. Come on, Elon. You can do this. You don't have to be stupid about this. Just give me more options. But Final Fantasy VII Remake's in the lead, which there's a lot of comments about. You gotta play Classic first. You really do. And I'm like,
You actually kind of
okay.
do.
Second is Final Fantasy VII Classic, and third is other. With I think a lot of people were saying Final Fantasy VI.
Yeah,
Of course.
I know
Yarden
Rebecca said
was
Final Fantasy 6 as well as a few
Rebecca
others.
and Yarden, the top people that would influence my gaming decisions is definitely 6. I do have 4 as well. A lot of people said 10, and I hope you just regretted that decision, guys. Like 10 is let me tell you, it's the garbage of all Final. I'm just messing with you guys.
We've
I'm
had
sure
this
10
discussion before. Like discussion.
Yes.
I hate Final Fantasy 10. I'm just gonna say it. I don't like that game.
It's a vile RPG. Let me tell you.
It also makes me very sad that it was the last traditional turn-based Final Fantasy game. It was Final Fantasy 10.
Yeah, and they moved away from that.
And they moved away from it after that game. But yeah, I don't like
that nonsense.
Yeah.
Anyways,
a lot of votes for 9 as well. 9 actually came up a lot in your comments.
9 came up a lot. So I don't want. Next week I'll tell you my decision. How about that?
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, so since Yarden asked, obviously the correct answer is Parasite Eve, but because I'm barred from saying Parasite Eve, because Parasite Eve is apparently not a Final Fantasy game, so it doesn't count, even though Garret should play it. I think, it's a toss-up because like you should really finish Final Fantasy VII Classic. I agree with people in saying you shouldn't play Remake without playing Classic because
got it.
Remake in a way is kind of a sequel to the original game, if that makes sense. Like that,
okay.
Trust me, it'll make sense when you actually play it. Where a lot of the stuff that happens in Remake won't make any sense to you if you didn't play the original game. Plus, I think some of the emotional sections or some of the sections in the game will actually hit you harder if you played the original game, like it did for me. Like I actually really like that stuff. Which is why, like, if you're going to play 7 at all, I think you definitely start with Classic rather than Remake. Even though Remake, I think, is more approachable. So honestly, and Yarden actually points out the answer I was going to probably go to. Final Fantasy 9 is probably the one I suggest. It's either that or Final Fantasy 6. I think both of them are great options. And it almost doesn't matter which one you play because they don't really connect to any other games. And I think they're great standalone games. And also they're great classic Final Fantasy games.
No one's saying 12, which is interesting. Like no one.
I know how you feel about MMOs though, Garret. And
okay. I think I'm more related to that just because it does feel like Xenoblade.
Yeah.
In a way.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. Like if you like Xenoblade's combat, then you actually probably will like Final Fantasy 12 because Final Fantasy 12 feels like playing Final Fantasy 11 or another MMO, which kind of in a way is what Xenoblade kind of felt like too when playing it. So
yeah.
You'd probably actually be right at home with 12. And 12's got an amazing story with a great cast of characters. Like it's got a lot of political intrigue. So if you're into the political stuff that Final Fantasy does, then actually you would probably really like 12 a lot. But yeah, there's a bunch of different directions you could go in this. But to answer Yarden's question, to settle, I'll say 9, but 6 is very.
I've heard about the 9 remake though. About it's kind of,
and that's why it might be better just to wait even on 9, and which is why like 6 might be the best choice because they're probably not going to remake 6, and even if they do, like the Super Nintendo version of 6 is like a masterpiece of a game.
Yeah, that's what I hear. So
yeah, although all 3 of them are, to be fair, just to give the others credit, like Final Fantasy 4 and 5 are all 3 of those games are masterpiece games, and deserve to be played at some point. Which is why I think Pixel remasters of all 3 of them would be the best way to play them at this point.
I do have Final Fantasy. I did buy Final Fantasy 4 in the after years via PSN, and it's on my Vita.
Nice.
And it's looking good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only thing that's missing is the fast forward mode from the Pixel remasters, but otherwise it's still a way to play.
I do have 4 on Steam as well, so I might do that. And then if I'm really into it, I can go to the after years separately on the Vita.
Yeah, the after years is definitely worth playing as well if you like Final Fantasy 4. if you do end up playing the original game. But yeah, I mean, honestly, yeah, the world is your oyster when it comes to Final Fantasy games, Garrett, because lot of them that you haven't played are really good. And it'll be just deciding, all right, which one of these do I want to play? And actually, if I knew, Garrett, that you were thinking of going back and playing some of the older ones, you should almost play them in the order they released in, not because they relate to each other, but because it'll make
you see the progression, kind of thing.
Not only that too, but it'll make playing the older games easier. Because if you play 6 and then go back and play 4, it's gonna feel weird to play that game, or 5 because of the way that the some of the stuff controls. So I think it actually is better to do that. And 5, again, a lot of people didn't suggest it, but I actually think 5 is a very solid game that is kind of underrated for sure.
Okay. Sounds good.
Cool. Final Fantasy. It's exciting, Garrett. We all love Final Fantasy here. But before we go,
I'll definitely be playing some more for sure.
Yep. Well, that is the end of the show, Garrett. But before we go, Garrett, plugs go.
You can follow me at Twitter at BlandExplosion. And then you can just find me on the Discord. I'm very active on the RPG Cave channel, and then also at the Play Some Video Games Discord channel as well. We got the Portable Pros over there. Nice. And we're very active over there with the ROG Ally, the Steam Decks. I really want to push that. Maybe carpool gaming, we have more of a Steam Deck / handheld presence. I know some people out there.
Yeah,
you love your PC handhelds as well. So please let me know. Put some noise in the Discords.
I was gonna say we see a lot of that talk in the PC section, but there's that, to your point, there's not as many people doing that as you would hope. But I also think should not enough of our people in our community have those devices yet. I think it's mostly just, I know you and Matt have one, and I don't know of anyone else who has a Steam Deck or any.
Okay. People let me know. Tweet at me at BlandExplosion if you have a Steam Deck and you're part of the carpool gaming community. Let me know.
Or let us know in the Discord, in the PC gaming section as well.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah. As for me, you can find me on the old Twitter at Ryan Turford. And you can also find me on Threads. I made a Threads account just for the heck of it. I'm on Ryan Turford over there. I don't know if I'll ever use it because at this point, because I wanted to, of course, pre-save my name because I saw so many people, Garrett, who didn't get their names on Threads. So I'm like, if we ever have to go there, I would rather just have my name actually there. So that's why I actually signed up for it at this point. But yeah, I'm on Threads technically, but I'm not actually actively using it.
It's really pointless to follow anyone apparently on Threads.
Well, because they don't have
random.
Yeah, there's no feed to just look at your followers. So it's just a bunch of random crap from
What's the point of
Instagram.
Followers?
No, exactly.
So weird.
That's why I'm not all in on Threads at this point, because I like the app a lot. But I don't like that part of it, which is why I'm just like, yeah, I'll wait until we know for sure what's going to happen there. But also you can find us on Twitter, Carpool Gaming as well, youtube.com/Carpool Gaming. Of course, our website, carpoolgaming.com, and of course, podcast services around the globe. So for Garrett Bland, I'm Ryan Turford. This has been the 100th level of the RPG Cave, and we're out. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.